when it was like Trump versus Biden, it was really easy to just kind of say, well, look at how Biden talks, look at how he speaks, it's very obvious that he's not mentally capable of being president, blah, blah, blah. And then you get Trump, who, in comparison, looked like a lot more articulate, a lot more, at least domineering when he spoke. Like, you can at least give him credit for having a presence over Biden, like a kind of like commanding presence, which people look up to. But then when you have Harris versus Trump, people are starting to realize, well, Trump's also like almost an 80-year-old man, or he is an 80-year-old man.
Yeah, 79. He turned or will turn 79 soon.
Oh,
I think he already did at his birthday.
All intents and purposes.
Yeah. Well, he will be over 80 by the time he is president. So
he's not a Mick Jagger.
So you have Harris, who is very articulate because she was, I think, a DA prosecutor, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she's very articulate. She understands how to argue very well, how to argue her points across, how to appeal to her base. And it's kind of making Trump look like the old man who doesn't know what he's doing anymore, which is a huge, like, they don't know how to deal with that, because now when like Trump goes and like talks like how he usually did, like just talk everywhere without hardly any preparation, now it's starting to come back to bite him, because if he does like a talk on like the X space, whatever, with Elon Musk, and he's just like talking about like, oh, I talked to Putin and said, Putin, don't do it, Putin. I was like, it's like, it's like, there's no way it's gonna work, and it's like, what do you know?
Putin said, there's no way, and then Trump said,
like, way. Yeah. It's just, like, all those things used to be what made him so appealing, because he was so unfiltered. It was just so like, it felt very authentic, even if it wasn't actually authentic. It felt authentic, and that's what gave him that credit. But now it doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, so I know you had your hand raised. We'll get to you in a second. I just wanted to follow up just very briefly on this. So, do you think that, I mean, you mentioned Kamala Harris as a prosecutor. Do you think her experience as a prosecutor, maybe speaking for juries, would help on the campaign trail? Is that sort of what you were suggesting?
I mean, yeah, definitely. It would have a significant impact on her. Like,
try to build a persuasive case in front of juries?
Yeah, overall, I mean, just also the fact that she's just generally younger, and she has like more mental cognition as opposed to a near 80-year-old man.
Now, actually, I promise I will get to you in just a second, but this gets to something we were talking about last year. Yeah, she's younger. She's 60.
What's wrong with old people?
She's 60. And that's actually older than the average president historically. So her and Tim Walz are basically the same age, which is shocking when you see them standing there. But the younger candidate is still older than most presidents have ever been. Okay. So again, you wanted to. I've been holding you back too long. Go ahead.
No, comparing to like 2016 and 2020, there's definitely a difference with the Democrats. In 2016, Hillary was their standard elitist, smug candidate. There was a whole thing with the Bernie Sanders voters. They hated her. They didn't come out and vote. Hillary ignored the Rust Belt entirely. Kamala went to Pennsylvania like that, and then Minnesota, and a bunch of Kamala's VP picks a lot better. There's a lot more enthusiasm in the Democratic base right now than 2016, and especially in 2020 when Biden was just your random old white man candidate that didn't enthusiase the base like Kamala has. And I think Trump and the Republicans have no idea how to respond to that. They're just throwing everything at the wall, and it's not really working right now.
I was going to add to his point. I would say the Democratic Party right now is very similar to that of 1968. So you're seeing a gap with moderates and progressives right now, especially with the youth, with supporting the Palestinians and against the Israeli forces right now. And I do fear, though, that might hurt the Democratic chances, causing a lot less voter turnout with the youth, especially. Very similar to 1968, where Hubert Humphrey was running, and a lot of people didn't like him because he didn't have as a anti-war stance as many of the progressives like RFK and who else? But yeah. basically like they're still very moderate, and I think isolating the progressives on that one issue might hurt them with voter turnout.
Yeah.
Just want to come back to this notion of energizing the base. In 2020, was the Democratic base not energized? It seems to me that it was energized. It just wasn't energized on behalf of Biden. It was energized against
It was a
Trump.
negative energy,
And so, I would say that there's probably energy still there in 2020, but is this a fundamentally different beast in terms of energizing that base, and what would be the significance of that?
I mean, I think it's definitely, definitely a lot more positive energy, especially if you compare like this year's RNC to this year's DNC. Like if you've tuned in, like you'll notice the energy difference between like, Milwaukee and Chicago. Like the RNC was like very bland, and like all of their speeches were like doom and gloom, like the country is horrible, millions of immigrants are everywhere, it's like, America's collapsing or whatever. But then you go to the DNC and it's like basically a concert, honestly. You know what I mean? I don't know if anyone tuned in last night to watch like that celebratory roll call, but like that was just like, they definitely have like a very positive energy coming into this election.
It's interesting, and we're going to cover that in our class, that in recent years political parties have been trying to bury the roll call because it just looked silly on prime time, and both parties had originally moved it to the daytime when nobody's watching the convention, and then kind of hit it all together, and now they seem to be bringing it back. And the Democrats, it was pure theater because the roll call had already been done virtually some 2 weeks before. So it was pure theater, and theater with an in-house band, and some special guest musicians, et cetera, et cetera. You had your hand up before, so please
Yeah.
go ahead.
I do agree with you. I do see a lot more unity within the Democratic Party compared to. I believe that since someone mentioned the Palestinian issue, I do think that it's not as bad as we see it now. I think now with Kamala being the Democratic nomination, we're seeing more unity among the moderates and progressives on this issue. And definitely with, it would have been a lot worse if Joe Biden still continued to run as incumbent for the presidential election because of how, I guess, wishy-washy he has been when it comes to this issue of Israel and Palestine. But I have noticed a lot more unity within the party compared to, I would say, that RNC, with it being more, I would say, divided with the sort of extreme policies that we've been saying. Because mind you, the RNC, they've been having to battle both for the moderates and the more extreme folk with the Project 2025. We've seen, Trump try and distance himself from this very extreme course of action if he does win the election. So I do think there is more division among the Republicans compared to the Democrats in this election. And if I'm not mistaken, 1968 was when Lyndon B. Johnson didn't run for a second term. And I think that's the last time we've had a president not run for a second term, if I'm not mistaken. So I could be wrong.
The last time not run for a second term, I think you're correct. Of course, we have had some one-term or partial-term presidents, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, but they ran and lost.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's the last one, and Trump, of course.
And Bush.
And Bush, yeah, who
One of
ran
the
and
Bushes.
lost. But yeah, he was the last one to withdraw.
Yeah.
He was the last one to still be eligible and withdraw.
Are there cases before him, before LBJ?
Yes, going back. Well, yes, going back into the past, but you'd have to go back to the 19th century.
Yeah, it's like
I don't think there's anybody else in the 20th century
Yeah.
who declined to run for a second term. And of course, the LBJ and Biden were somewhat different in that LBJ dropped out on March 31st, which back then was way before the process started. They had just had the New Hampshire primary. So they had just had the very first primary, and he actually won it, but he won it by a narrow enough margin that it said to him, with the Vietnam War raging and the Democrats divided, et cetera, that he was going to have a tough time, so he decided to drop out. The difference with Biden, of course, is that Biden went through the whole process and won 99% of all the delegates and then dropped out. I mean, we have candidates dropping out all the time. In that sense, this isn't that unusual. What's unusual is the leading candidate dropping out after they were already assured of the nomination. I want, a couple of you I know have your hands up again. I wanted to follow up on something that you had mentioned just briefly, and something that I had heard discussed at the convention, not at the convention, but commentary on the convention last night, and that is that if Joe Biden had stayed in the race, it would have been a very different campaign. And I get that sense, and you saw Biden speak on night one, and you get the sense that Joe Biden would have run a much darker campaign, that his focus was on democracy and the threats to democracy. And the longer he goes, the more you get the sense that Joe Biden deeply dislikes, and that might be a polite word, Donald Trump. Whereas Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, both of them, they kind of feed off of one another, seem to be running a much more upbeat, much more positive campaign. Still, of course, attacking Trump, but from a very different position. You had your hand up, then we'll go back to you. Did you?
Yeah, I kind of was going back to some of the previous statements. It was just like how big of a difference is between people's views when Biden was running versus Kamala. Like, I remember when Biden was still running, all of like the jokes of maybe the race should be an actual race, like just see if they could run a mile, walk a mile. I saw like things about like, it was a joke about they're supposed to be able to walk a mile in your shoes. I don't think that they can walk a mile on their own. Like, that was like some of the stuff that I was like seeing, and you can definitely see like a hopeful change happen whenever it switched to Kamala. Like, there's actually someone who you can understand and like seems upbeat, positive about the future of the country.
And you could see a change. You could see almost a visible change in the Democratic Party once Joe Biden stepped down. When he was still running, yeah, people thought, okay, he has a path to victory. He could win, but he's falling behind. He did awful in that debate, and people worried about his age and his ability to serve out his term, et cetera, et cetera. And then Kamala Harris comes along, and it's almost like a huge sigh of relief, right? By the way, there's an old saying about that, walk a mile in somebody's shoes. They say, before you criticize somebody, you should walk a mile in their shoes. If you still don't see their point, at least you're a mile away, and you've got their shoes. So.
Yeah, just to kind of expand on your point you made, when you look at the debate between Biden and Trump, they both just exchanged insults back and forth. Like, Biden would just be like, oh, you called veterans suckers, and Trump would be like, no, and also your son did this. Well, I don't think he actually mentioned his son that much, actually, in the debate, which is kind of surprising, but he
did once, and he did in anger. Biden reacted very angrily.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this extreme animosity and confrontation. I think that's probably one of the main reasons why Harris and Trump probably aren't going to debate. Because if they do debate, it's gonna Trump's gonna throw the insults because that's just his MO, and then Harris is gonna try to maintain her campaign consistency of trying not to just attack Trump like Biden was trying to do. So it just makes sense they wouldn't debate because that would be all it would have to devolve into.
They are scheduled to debate in about 3 weeks. So we'll see. Did you have your hand up before?
I did, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I think that part of the success with Donald Trump's campaign is they managed to do a really good job building his character with the and this isn't really something he did, but the assassination helped him a lot. The attempted, the mugshot from when he got arrested, and a lot of the other stuff. Because also he's been even before he's a politician, he was a TV personality and a businessman for years. So he is very good at marketing and being a character. And Joe Biden as a character couldn't match him at all. He's old, and everyone thought of him as decrepit and mentally on the decline. I think Kamala could be that person. She could not necessarily be a character on Donald Trump's level, but she could she could be enough of a character to where she's in serious competition for Trump, I suppose.
Even with the change, this is going to be a close election. It is going to be closer than the last two elections. There is a good chance that neither, if you know your electoral college, there's a good chance that neither candidate will get 300 electors, which the last two elections, Biden and Trump each got, 306 electors? There's a good chance that neither one will get that. There is a decent possibility that whoever wins will win with just the exact amount, 270 to win. And of course, all of that means there are going to be challenges and legal cases. And if you think 2020 was busy in that respect, wait till you see December of this year. So it is by no means, momentum may have shifted for the Democrats, but it's by no means going to be a runaway for that team, for the Democratic Party.
Sorry. And you said even with the change, it won't be, I don't know, runaway, or is it because of the change it won't be? Because was it going to be a runaway if Biden had remained the candidate?
Well, I mean, it's all speculation now. I think Biden could have recovered, and his own aides that were trying to talk him out of the race were saying, yes, we do see a path to victory, but the way they convinced Biden, from what I have read and seen, is that they said, yes, you can win this, but it will be at the expense of a severely divided political party.
But down ballot votes, right?
And yes, and down ballot where the House and the Senate are both very, very evenly divided, and that could cost control of both houses of Congress.
And just one other thing, in terms of thinking about the nature of the campaigns, comparing, the Biden approach to Harris as a candidate, did Biden have any choice other than to try and make it about Trump when you talk about some of the weaknesses he had as a candidate, not just age and perceptions of issues there, but the record? And as much as the Trump campaign may try to continue to tie Harris to the Biden record and administration, it is very different than Biden himself being the candidate. And so, I don't know that Biden had a choice but to try and make it a referendum on Trump, whereas Harris has options.
I would like to disagree with that point. I think Biden had a lot better record with economic populism, especially with the workforce. He's the only president to stand with the picket line. And I fear that Kamala does not have that experience with unions and working class peoples in order to mobilize, especially the white working class, in order to pull support.
I think that's what Tim Walz does. Tim Walz is a union guy, very strong union guy. He once joked that that people were criticizing that he was in the pocket of unions, and then he said that he was the pocket, so I think that Walz is a very strong labor. Also, they also had the UAW president at the DNC, right? And he was there,
Sean Fain.
Yeah, Sean Fain, there you go. I was getting him confused with the other Sean, that was the Teamsters guy. He was there, and they also brought in Bernie Sanders as well, even though he wasn't even a candidate this time. And also they, brought in AOC as well. So they're really bringing in very popular, progressive, labor, people. And I think that with the Walz pick, Kamala actually is doing a pretty good job, making sure that is secured.
Yeah, he essentially said what I was going to say. The whole pick of Tim Walz kind of brings together that progressive vote, especially considering during the VP search, Bernie Sanders backed him. He went on all the national networks, said, pick Tim Walz, he's a progressive candidate, he's pro-union. So I feel like any real doubt about some massive progressive or blue-collar vote kind of sealed it with Walz in a sense. I know they're working on a ceasefire right now for the whole Gaza war or genocide or however you want to describe it. So I think it's all now kind of dependent on how Hamas responds to it. I know there's protests going on, but I don't think they're as serious or as bad or threatening to the Democrats' chance at winning presidency now with the Walls pick and how Harris has responded, while Biden kind of just ignored the whole thing. He kind of just said some words. He didn't really seem to want a ceasefire or really care. He just met with Netanyahu a few times. I know Kamala, as soon as she announced her candidacy, she's like, I'm not meeting with Netanyahu at all. I'm not talking to him, I'm not speaking to him when we get a ceasefire worked out, which I think is already a lot better than how Biden responded to it.
Okay, you wanted to say something, then we'll go back to.
Yeah, so on the aspect of the on the unions, I do see a way bigger improvement with the SOCDEMs and the unions with Kamala compared to Biden. Because mind you, I don't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago, but there was the railroad strike that Biden busted, signed the bill and busted that strike, which really angered all of the SOCDEMs in that sort of area and unions too. So I do see a greater alliance between the unions and Kamala within this election. And going back to unity, you know, that's where I see it is. I'm just seeing a lot more, I guess, more, and also like just even in general, like I don't think Joe Biden was very interested in the more socialist aspects of the Democratic Party, but now we're seeing that area being bolstered and supported, which I think will do really well for voter turnout with voter turnout. Because in the past few years, the Socialist Party has been very kind of beaten down and very jaded these past few years, especially with Biden. So I do see like a very big improvement in that area with the Kamala being the VP elect, the president-elect now.
I was just going to mention, I've also seen stuff about them supporting farmers, which is actually against some of the Republican pushing for like decreasing funding for farms. So I saw more like the Democratic Party wanting to expand farming programs, as well as I've seen a lot of stuff about the tip culture too, and changing taxes on tips, which kind of goes along with like the blue collar stuff.
Okay, and you know, now that we've been like kind of talking about like Tim Walz and vice presidential picks, right? I mean, I think it's like, you know, Trump picking J.D. Vance was like, I guess like, I think it is like genuinely a historically bad vice presidential pick in terms of favorability. Because I think, you know, people are like, oh, Sarah Palin was like a bad VP, right? But she still had like positive favorability. J.D. Vance has negative favorability, which is like a first for like vice presidential candidates.
I'd have to argue, Tyler, at least among the, like some Republicans, J.D. Vance was a unique choice by Trump, but a very strategic one, because he kind of tells the story. Like Trump is a storyteller at the end of the day. He's an entertainer. And J.D. Vance with his Hillbilly Elegy and then his movie that came out after it, it's like the small town guy wants to imagine himself leaving his town and living that life per se. I'm not saying realistically, but you get like the gist that I'm trying to make, and J.D. Vance says that for people. And I also don't think that the vice president pick, I know now like the past 8 years it's been really important, but I'm not sure if like historically the vice president even really mattered at all. I'm pretty sure parties used to pick like their vice president from the other party just as like to almost mock them per se, because like they didn't have as much power as the vice president once did before, I think the 21st Amendment, where they changed how you vote for them. But yeah, that was like the only point that I disagreed with. I don't think that J.D. Vance is unfavorable. I think if like, depending on how you look at it, he was like a very, I don't know, strategic choice by Trump. I wouldn't have, if I were him, I wouldn't have.
Like one of the problems, right? Okay, if like, you know, if we're gonna get like a little like, you know, I guess theorizing as to why he was chosen, he wrote the foreword for Project 2025. So, like, you know, in my world, the reason he was chosen was because he was the sensible, like, stooge that was gonna, like, actually carry Project 2025 out. If you know, they were elected, right? They were gonna put the guy in there that was like, all right, this guy, like, you know, he isn't Trump. He'll, like, actually, you know, focus and, like, do what we, you know, enact our plan, you know? And, you know, it's, you know, in an election where, like, you know, you're really having to, you know, pick at the margins here for, like, desperately trying to convince, you know, undecided voters to, like, vote for your party. I think that, like, Vance and, like, just all of the things he said, and also the fact that, like, you know, very awkwardly, he compared Trump to Hitler once, very awkwardly, but then also, you know, has, like, all these clips of, you know, him, like, saying, like, just very, like, you know, just blatantly misogynistic things that are just, like, you know, really are not helping Republicans sell the, we're definitely not trampling on women's rights, you know, you know, they're not really helping that allegation.
Yeah, last point. In 2016, like, nobody liked Trump. Like, not even Republicans liked Trump. Everybody said something bad about him. And you can almost say the same thing for Kamala Harris, because in 2020, she did run for president, and it was an unsuccessful campaign. And it was clear amongst Democratic leaders that she wasn't even popular, at least as a person. I'm not gonna get into all of that. I'm just saying that, like, to point out what somebody said 4 years ago about a person who wasn't even a politician at the time, he was still just an entertainer.
Well,
like,
what is it about, like, oh, is it fair or not? It's, you know, people are going to see that in the news cycle and be like, oh, I don't like this guy sucks. You know what I mean?
Okay, first Joe. And then
Let me just come back to something you mentioned on kind of this notion of where did a vice presidential nominee fit into this? And I would ask people, you know, here, you know, is that vice presidential nominee have any bearing on your thinking about the election, who you would vote for president? And you're probably a lot more interested and engaged in this than your average citizen. You're here. For your average citizen, does it make a damn bit of difference who that vice presidential nominee is? So, you know, are we just wasting our breath even talking about it?
There is the traditional argument that vice presidential candidates don't really matter. I have a question for you, though, specifically, and this may be a little bit of inside baseball, but going back to 2008, when John McCain chose Sarah Palin, we mentioned her before, there was some talk of him selecting Joe Lieberman from Connecticut, who was an independent Democrat. Do you think that would have made any difference at all if they had had basically a bipartisan ticket?
I think that is fundamentally different in many ways.
I mean, that's a situation that doesn't present itself very often.
Across the aisle, almost, even though he was independent caucusing, right, with Democrats, and yeah, that potentially is very different scenario than, oh, I'm picking somebody who is a swing state, you know,
right,
or speaks to this certain demographic within the party. Would it have made the difference?
There would have been that sort of like to the Jewish vote, yes, because of Lieberman's connections with Reform Judaism and stuff. But Sarah Palin became an immediate rock star. I mean, she had charisma. She lit up that campaign, kind of in a way that Kamala was one thing. You know, she was, but Waltz is that was just this huge second wind in the sails. So
Palin was a big plus to begin with, but she did become a drag on the campaign eventually.
Eventually,
yeah.
But, you know.
Okay, and I guess again, my point with Palin and Lieberman was that I mean it may have been a very different campaign with Lieberman as opposed to Palin, but that still doesn't mean vice presidents will always be decisive. That's sort of the exception, that's sort of the potential exception that proves the rule, so to speak. Go ahead.
I mean, I think that this election, there's been like a lot of like fires between like shots taken between the two different vice presidents, right? Like because they're both actually veterans. Both J.D. Vance, he served 4 years in the Marine Corps, and then Tim Waltz is a Command Sergeant Major in the National Guard. They both were at one point in the United States military, and J.D. Vance used that because he tried to, I mean, I've looked into a little bit, not totally into, I don't know exactly what comments Tim Waltz made, but my overall impression is that they're just trying to claim that he claimed additional service stuff, like, you know, being deployed or that he did extra stuff. And I remember there's one thing also about like him leaving his unit before it deployed to Iraq, but that's like a 2-year mobilization time. Like plenty of people get on and off rosters for mobilization. That's not that uncommon. But the point is that they're turning that into a kind of issue. I actually have heard that said before in regular conversation about Tim Waltz, is that, oh, he's like, you know, stolen valor, he's just, you know, this, that, or the other, because he's trying to claim things he didn't do, telling veteran status he doesn't have. But it just seems to be coming from a place of like almost misinformation more than like anything else. But J.D. Vance has that credibility as having served in the Marine Corps and having deployed to Iraq in a non-combat role, but still deploying nonetheless. It kind of gives him that additional, because Trump has said that it wouldn't mean as much, but because J.D. Vance is saying it and he's a veteran, that gives like that extra bit, and that just happened to just work out that way because Tim Waltz wasn't the pick before J.D. Vance. So
Now, here's a question that I've raised a lot recently, and we're talking about vice presidential candidates right now. But it seems to me that military service, we tend to think that military service is a big plus for candidates. And yet, if you look back, winning candidates, Donald Trump never served in the military, Barack Obama never served in the military, Bill Clinton never served in the military. Right? Sorry? Yeah, exactly. John McCain served in the military for a long time, very valiantly, and he lost. It seems to me that while we talk about military service as being a big plus for candidates, it doesn't seem to make a difference one way or the other. And that's at the presidential level, and we're already talking about how vice presidents really don't change the race itself. So is this all just a lot of talk between the two campaigns so that they just have something to say? Or is there really something that we can say about Vance's service or about Walz's service?
It's just, I think it just worked out in just a certain way to where if J.D. Vance wasn't a veteran, or Pitt wasn't a veteran, there would have been no ammunition to be used against that. It just would have been like, oh, Tim Waltz joined the National Guard. Maybe some people might call him out for whatever reason about that, but I think that in general, military service is a very like minor part of a campaign. Like that's, like, it might be a plus, especially if you actually did something extremely good, like Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. Like that's an achievement all on its own. So going to the presidency was just like one step ahead. Like it's just one step separated from that.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, in the 19th century, and maybe through World War II, it was a thing, because Eisenhower didn't have any political experience before that at all. But since then,
I would almost argue that being Allied commander of Europe had some political.
In a way, yes. In a way, executive experience. Yes, yeah. You're right. But since the 1960s, military service doesn't seem to really have made any difference whatsoever in who gets elected and who doesn't get elected. And yet we constantly think that it does.
Probably because there's less. I'm sorry if I'm interrupting.
That's okay. Go ahead, and then we'll go back.
But in World War II, you had like millions of people serve. There were millions of veterans after World War II. So these people aged alongside other veterans of World War II who would go to become candidates for president. So like JFK served on a torpedo boat in the Pacific. Yeah, so he had that background. A lot of other, I think, wasn't it, the first Bush also, I think, served in World War II. Yeah, so
there's actually footage of him being rescued after being shot down in World War II.
Yeah.
Film footage. Yeah.
But now, World War II veterans, Korean veterans, Vietnam veterans even, are dying off very, very quickly. So there is like proportionally, I think like the least amount of veterans we've had compared to the rest of the population in America, maybe not American history, but at least in recent history. So the whole veterancy status is kind of seen as like especially since we've had a large scale conflict, but we've never had we haven't had like a World War II scenario, Vietnam scenario. We've had Global War on Terror, which is a lot harder to like see individual commanders being like, this is their victory. They did this victory, like, because you had Eisenhower, you had D-Day, you had, in Korean War, you had MacArthur and the landings in Korea and stuff, but when you think about like Global War on Terror, there's no like these big operations where it's like, this is the guy who saved the day, here's the commander that saved the day. It's a lot harder to like give credit to people on like individual operations when you're doing counterinsurgency. So I think that also plays a role too. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, then
At least with like the arguments back and forth between like the vice presidents, I see it as almost like a military culture thing. Because it reminded me, I think it was you that mentioned like the 60s and 70s. It reminded me about my like grandfather, and he wouldn't, he was in the National Guard, but he wouldn't take anything from like being in the military at all because he considered himself a draft dodger because he joined the National Guard and he didn't get deployed overseas. So he wouldn't take anything from that. And I know that there's like a lot of military culture about like it being more important that you had served overseas, that you were actually in active combat than being in the military just here. So I think it just has to do something with like the culture that's in the military and whether you fit in active combat scenarios.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is that it's funny about is that J.D. Vance, in order in the Marine Corps, you get a combat action rating. He doesn't have one of those. He didn't actually, I mean, he might have been at combat adjacent, but at least from what I've seen, he never actually saw combat. And neither did Tim Walz. But if you go by experience-wise, like, even though J.D. Vance did he did a 4-year contract, whereas Tim Walz served up to becoming a command sergeant major in the National Guard. So like experiential-wise, you can say that Tim Walz has a longer and probably more contributive service record than J.D. Vance, if you just go off of that. But
what I was getting to is I think it's more important to the two of them and then maybe some of the military people than it is to just standard citizens.
So you think it's kind of like an inside discussion that's not, that we're not really.
Almost like just like seeing like the jobs and
Involved
whether
in.
you're like for the team, maybe that would be important. Like if you're like very much like Democratic or Republican, then maybe you're like, yeah, but not really the regular civilian really understands or particularly cares a whole lot about.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I guess like in terms of like a civilian perspective for like veteran favorability, right? I mean, like World War II was the last war that was like, yeah, America really fought and like did something really good with this, and then that's like the Korean War and the Vietnam War. It's like, oh, you served in that. It's like, oh, well, this is kind of just sad. Like, you know, I mean, you didn't really do anything glorious in Vietnam. You just kind of like, you know, it was just us like, you know, very sadly like, you know, just flailing around for no
You
reason.
survived.
Well, we
if you
had
were
John
lucky.
Kerry. John Kerry was like, that was one of the big things that he used is that like he is, I think a Silver Star recipient, and he had 3 Medal of Honor, or not Medal of Honors, Purple Hearts, 2 Purple Hearts. And that was like a big thing by his campaign. They still lost to Bush, who had no veterans to say. So.
Yeah, but definitely with the, I do think in today's sort of culture, we don't really have as much of a reverence of sort of veterans when they enter politics as we did before. Also, but I agree with you, like, you know, Vietnam and onward, our perception, the general public's perception of the U.S. and its wars has been very negative, and so we don't really have like that. It's not like in the Civil War where when Grant won the presidency because he was the general that won the Civil War, and people were supportive on that basis. Now, of course, being a veteran doesn't mean you're going to be good at politics. Grant was a pretty bad president, really, really awful. But I do think, like, in terms of like your, you know, being a veteran, it doesn't really affect your chance at politics as it once did, 60, 70 years ago. I have like a general question, but like, what are the stakes of this election? I mean, is this election that's like going to be like, oh, we're going to have another sort of bad 4 years, and you know, one guy wins? or is this like the election, the end-all election, is a threat to democracy? You know, because is Project 2025? My question is this going to be like really bad, or is it going to be just a minor thing that will just mess up our system for a bit? But once Trump gets out, the other future president will fix it. Like, what are the stakes? Is this the election that end all democracy?
So again, if Joe Biden had stayed in the race, we think it seems pretty certain that he would have argued that it is about democracy and about the future of democracy. And I think Kamala Harris is going to argue some of that, but she seems as though she's going to be focusing more on bread and butter issues, so to speak, economic issues and other political issues, abortion rights, and some other more tangible issues. So, that's a legitimate question, and it tends to change depending on who's running, right? So is it about democracy? Is it about something else? Is this just another, or has it changed now to just being another typical presidential election? If we can say anything like that. We'll do you, and then we're going to close up. I'll give you some final words, okay?
I think seeing ripple effects from the Supreme Court rulings, like with the Roe versus Wade and the presidential immunity case. I think we're starting to see some serious effects from Trump, whether you're pro or against it. It's not really it's not what I'm trying to, it's gone completely blank, I'm sorry. No, it's like the whole, what's happened with Trump appointing these judges, you know. We had Roe versus Wade overturned for the first time in, 40 years? Even when we had Republican-controlled Congress or Supreme Court, it never got overturned. Then with presidential immunity, what happened on January 6th, Project 2025, and Trump's own, Agenda 47, there's just so many factors that makes it vastly more important, especially if you're on a Democratic, liberal, progressive side for this election than pretty much any election that I can think of. Yeah.
Okay, you want to close it out?
Yeah, just one last point is just that this is another presidential election, in my opinion. What we're seeing right now is party strategists and campaign managers fighting in between the margins. I think that if you were voting for Biden, you were voting for Kamala at this point. If you were voting for Trump, you're staying with Trump. And right now they're fighting for the in-betweeners. And so I really do appreciate every single one of you for coming. I hope to see you guys next Wednesday. I know that some of you have classes, so we are wrapping this up, I guess.
We'll see you here every Wednesday at noon, okay? Dominic, make sure I end
that. Get their supporters to the polls, not just so, it's, oh gee, yeah, I support it. I support.
Don, make sure I end this. This is.
Yeah, I'm gonna say.
Yeah, I know there's an end.
Yeah,
button.
do
I just wanna
something
make sure
about it.
that it's all.
Yes, sir.
And just on the state.